contest is such a, do you cuss on this show?
Fucking right, we cuss on this show.
Yeah, all right. It's such a mind fuck. I just wanted to make sure before I said the word.
You
do a lot of different types of shows. You never really know.
Yeah. All right, welcome to Spike Week. Special guest today, Ben Gretch, one of the other total sickos out there that are obsessed with the subject that we're going to talk about today, the Eliminator tournament on Underdog. I thought there was nobody better out there to discuss some Eliminator strategy than Ben. He's written multiple, as is the case with a lot of Ben's content, in depth, which I appreciate because that is clearly my style as well for anybody that has listened to this show before. But Ben has written some awesome strategic articles around the Eliminator on Underdog, and it is a totally we've never seen a fantasy football tournament like this, certainly not a best ball tournament like this Eliminator on Underdog. So I wanted to spend some time just chopping it up and riffing with Ben on some different strategic angles. Maybe by the end, we'll talk about some specific players or just some thoughts we have around this tournament, because like Ben, we were talking before the show, he has maybe some unique thoughts to some things that we've seen across the industry, or just maybe even like counterintuitive thoughts to what you might think the Eliminator is about. So we're going to dig into all of that today. But first, of course, Ben, how is it going? And how many Eliminators have you been able to get in? You know, how's been your experience thus far in these Eliminator drafts?
The experience has been fun. Those who follow my YouTube channel and know me know that I live in a state where I can't do the fast draft, so I have to go out of state, enter slows. And I've been doing the different contests when I can. Like I go out and I enter a bunch of slows in like batches. And so I've done, it's only like maybe 20 or 30 Eliminators at this point. I'm definitely going to ratchet that up. I think it's the most intriguing contest from a game theory perspective. I think because there's so much to consider and so many, like, one of the interesting things we'll get into is I think there's multiple ways you can play it based on sort of how your draft like unfolds, like what you're pushing in for. And because of that element, I think it's probably a pretty plus EV contest in the sense that I think drafters most of the field isn't likely to know the path they should be going down halfway through the draft, if that makes sense. And so they're going to be kind of like middling it a little bit and not necessarily pushing towards, one path or the other. But yeah, like you said, I mean, I wrote a strategy article on this that was like 6,000 words. And I always think that, bragging about how many words it is silly. Cause I mean, especially for me, cause I just am very like long winded when I write, but a big reason for that was I had all these different, sections, the pod math, the bye weeks. What about bye week and team stacking? I wrote a section called the shape of fantasy scores and trying to talk through how, this idea of that I think people think in the Eliminator you need to be safe, but how do you really build floor into a weekly score?
Yeah.
And I think you actually welcome in a little bit more volatility in some spots or in some cases across your build, because floor is actually hard to guarantee in fantasy. That gets back to like some concepts that you and I have talked about before, where the idea of like guaranteed touches with running backs aren't guaranteed, right? Like the things that people think they're buying on draft day are not buyable necessarily. It's not how football works or fantasy football works. And then had some like optimal strategy at the end, positional capital. These are the sections of the first piece I wrote. And then a few weeks later, I have another piece that I titled 6 more key notes on Underdog's Eliminator format.
That is brilliant. That reminds me so much through the written format of basically every podcast that I've ever recorded, where get about an hour and a half in, maybe 2 hours, and it's like, all right, so to wrap up and ... and then 2 hours later, it's like that's the written form of that. So you hit on a couple things that were just like bells going off. We'll get to those in a minute. The whole like guaranteed touches, and like I'll add the timing of production is something we speak a lot about in fantasy that we are really, really bad at predicting. I will probably mention multiple times Samaje Perine, which is a random name that people will probably not expect to be tossed around in the Eliminator, but he was a specific use case of that. Like you said, I'm buying touches and I'm buying early season production was a thing that I know I said last year, and I know probably a bunch of people said last year, and I don't even think it was like wrong. Like the premise isn't wrong, but the way the season plays out is just like there's so much chaos and variance that it doesn't always necessarily work that way. And all of those things play into how fun and unique the Eliminator specifically is, where we can have these ideas, but the NFL season just doesn't always align with like even logic. That like we're bringing logic into these drafts, but there's so much chaos and so much volatility that it just doesn't the idea, the premise, even the math sometimes doesn't play out in a way over the season that you can go in with well, look, Samaje Perine's going to get X amount of touches over the first month, right? Javante's coming back from a serious knee injury, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, he scored 4 points a game. Like who cares? Like you could have got that from any, 16th round running back or whatever. But really quick, I just want to pull up like kind of the advancement structure for anybody that is like unfamiliar with even what this Eliminator is. So it is clearly what you would expect it to be by the name. Every single week, starting in week 1, a certain percentage of teams in your group will be eliminated from the tournament. So I have it up by the percentage. I guess I can go to the actual advancement. So you start, right, just like any other best ball draft, just like most other fantasy football drafts, you draft against 11 other people, 12 total teams in your draft. You start there in week 1. And 10 out of that, based on only the week 1 scores, 10 out of 12 of those teams will move on to week 2. And then you will get into a new group of 10 people. And then you kind of see on your screen here, it works its way down all the way to week 17. You got to keep basically not being at the bottom of your group from every week, from week 1 to week 16 to make it to week 17. And then 115 total teams make it to week 17. And that's when obviously all the, you profit before week 17, but that's when all the real money comes in. You got to navigate this gauntlet, this Eliminator all the way every single week without bottoming out with that individual team to make it to week 17. And then I did just want to pull up the kind of percentages. I always like to view it through 2 different lenses. It looks like, don't finish. I got to finish in the top 10 in week 1. Okay, there's 83%. And it feels like in the Eliminator, just this part of it can also be a little bit misunderstood, where it's like, yeah, you don't need to bottom out. Like that's ultimately kind of the thing. But also like it does get significantly tougher over the course of the entire season, right? Like we start to get into week 7, like, okay, we went from 83% to 63% advance. We get into week 11, like we're closer to a 50-50 as opposed to, a top 80 percentile. And then by week 15, it is a 50-50. You got to finish in the top. Now those groups got smaller, as we see here, right? The groups go down from 12 to 10, but that's not a big and those teams are probably pretty good and probably pretty healthy. So you're facing it is a lot tougher to move on throughout this than it may seem at face value to me. And that was one of my first kind of initial structural tournament structure takeaways.
That was one of my first ones as well. And I made this little table in my first sheet that talks about some of the stuff that you're mentioning, as well as the prize if eliminated. I just shared with you, just pulled it up. The prize if eliminated on the far right column shows when you get into the money. This is the table that I made for that second article, where when I said 6 more key notes, the first like new note when I pulled up that next one was you might not even make it to the bye weeks. Because in the first one I was talking about, you want to front load your bye weeks because it's easier to get through the earlier pod. So you want your guys on bye in week 5 or week 6. If you can get through that, if you can navigate that. But this third column here that's on the screen right now is the percent of the field remaining entering each week. And so you were talking about the amount that advances from the teams that are still remaining in those weeks, but it's like compounding interest, right? Only 83% of the field even gets out of week 1. Then only 80% of that gets out of week 2. Then only 80% of that gets out of week 3. And then only 70% of that gets out of week 4. And what that means is by the time you enter the week 5 buys, literally only 37% of the field is out there. 2/3 of the field is going to have been eliminated when we get to the first buys. And that is like the biggest thing that I would drive home about the whole thing that we could talk about on the show. I keep seeing the eliminator stuff discussed as if it's a game of floor about not getting dead last and all of these things. And what I've written about in both of my pieces is I think it actually means that to win the eliminator, I think the team that wins the eliminator is going to be a dominant ceiling team that is so good. It's like in one of your home leagues. If you've ever been in one of those leagues where somebody wins every week, we have an all play element to my longest running home league, and we call it the breakdown. They use the breakdown over on CBS. People have probably been familiar with this, all play, whatever. It means that you play every other 11 people in your league every week. And some years that'll be kind of close at the top. But if you've ever been in a league like this where there's a truly dominant team, they'll go like 11-0 a lot of the weeks against everyone else. They're scoring the most points every week. Some weeks they'll go 9-2. Some weeks they'll go 8-3. Other weeks they'll jump right back to 11-0, right? Like, and rarely are they finishing worse than like 6-5 against the rest of the league. Now, what's interesting about that is this is the same one league that I'm talking about where this team has to be truly dominant throughout, but they don't have to face anyone that has the same players that they have. What we have in this scenario is all of the great players that you have on your team. If you get your team through to week 5 and you're one of the 37%, or in week 7, only 21% remain. In week 9, only 9% of the teams remain. Literally by mid-season, you're down to the 10% range. And if you only make it to week 8, you can get into the money. That's how you min cash is week 8. So we can talk about this a bunch of different ways. One way to play it is you can backload your buys and play it as a cash game, right? You can draft all those week 12 and week 14 guys and just try to get there because only 2.3% of the field's even going to get to week 12. There's so many people that are thinking, I don't want to take the week 12 and week 14 buys because I want to win the whole thing. But I honestly think when we get to week 12 and 14, a lot of the group that's remaining in these pods is going to have an outsized weight of week 12 and week 14 buys. So if you do get there using the early buys, you're going to have an advantage at that point to continue to advance. But there's going to be a lot of people that are going to basically be playing it as a cash game, backloading those buys. But it is something where the point I was trying to make with that home league and the all play and this really dominant team, you got to be that much more dominant because when your team that you build is that good, as you mentioned, the pods get harder and harder. And so if you get into week 9 where there's only 9.2% of the field remaining, that 9.2% is overwhelmingly going to have the same players that you have that have helped you get there. So who are the next levers that your team's going to have? How are you going to have more upside built into your team? You're going to need back-weighted production as well as the front-loaded production. You're going to just need to have a truly dominant team. That's how you don't finish last in your pool 17 times in a row. It's not by shooting for the median, because if you shoot for the median, then you're going to have the week where you actually do fall down. I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive, but I think people think, well, I just got to have floor each week. You go for floor each week, then you don't have enough ceiling built into your lineup. You don't have enough 30-point spike week potential in your lineup every week. And you end up with the week where you run into a couple buys, a couple guys have floor games. There's not enough big scores to boost you up. This is that idea I was talking about in my first write-up, the shape of fantasy scoring. If you think about your whole roster is like a 15-point average or something, but doesn't have 25 or 30-point potential, and then there's a week where a couple of those 15-point guys are on bye and a couple of the other ones drop down to 8 points that week, there's nothing to offset that because you don't have the high-end scoring. The thing that correlates to strong scoring in fantasy on a weekly basis is how many 30-point weeks you got, how many spike weeks you got, how much ceiling you built in. And that sometimes comes with floor, but these wide band players are the ones that we shoot for in season-long leagues. We shoot for them in regular best ball formats. And I think people are thinking that in Eliminator, they should shoot for it less and they should be more balanced. I'm approaching it this the opposite way. I'm like, most of these teams are going to be dead by week 5 anyway. I need to hit everything. This needs to be the best team that I've built. It needs to have an immense upside. You can talk about that structurally. I mean, I want to let you get in here with some thoughts as well. But the other thing that I wrote about a little is I think you can get more extreme with your structures. I think this is a format that actually pushes you towards more extreme zero RB builds, for example. I know your audience is very familiar with zero RB because the idea of the redundancy at receiver and those things, I want to be even more sure that I'm dominating at receiver. That's how I'm going to build floor into my lineup.
Yep.
And then maybe I'll have some really low running back scoring at time, but it's really the imbalance that creates floor in my weekly scoring because I'm going to have spike weeks at receiver over and over and over again that can hold up my floor. And then I got to hit on some running backs too to build a really truly dominant team. But imbalance on draft day creates floor on, because there's enough contingency within the positional groups, maybe 2 elite tight ends, right? Maybe an elite quarterback and still do a 3 QB build. So you have enough QB potential. That's how I'm building a lot of my teams. Very zero RB, a lot of early running back or receivers, 2 elite tight ends, 3 QBs with an upside QB in that, where normally you'd stop at 2, but I still want 3 because I want floor in each of those 3 positional groups. And then running back's the one where I'm basically punting it off, but saying if I can hit on something late, if I can hit on this year's Mostert or Kyron, that's how I'm going to build a truly dominant team. If I don't hit on those, I'm getting enough floor out of the other 3 positions that that's how I'm building stability throughout each week. So anyway, there's so many more layers to this, but that's like right where I go from the beginning.
So first I will say, if anybody was sick of hearing about zero running back and they thought, well, the Eliminator is the perfect thing for me to not hear about zero running back anymore, you are sadly mistaken, because I agree with everything that Ben said. It might actually be the single best format.
It might be
for zero.
If you want to build a team that's going to bottom out, draft a bunch of running backs early. Like that's how it's
exactly. If you love your Saquons and Derrick Henrys and everything, like I hate to tell you, we're probably not going to be talking about them a lot here. So a couple different things. I mean, you nailed like just about everything, but one thing I wanted. So you saw at the bottom of the screen here, if you're watching, but for audio folks, obviously you can quickly see what Ben has in that third column about seriously how many teams get knocked up and how precipitously it falls off once we start to get into those bye weeks. Like you said, like we go from 50%, 37, 28, just a couple weeks later, we're down to less than 7% of the field is even left in this thing. And we still got almost half the season to go, right? By the time you get to week 10, God forbid you get to week 11 or week 12, we still have a third of this best ball tournament still left to go. And there's only 2 or 3% of the entire field left in there. Like that is a huge deal that goes, because it's framed right. It's great marketing. They did a great job, the naming, the Eliminator, and it sounds just like, this sounds like everybody's dream. Like, I don't got to worry about week 17. I just got to survive in advance. I only got to finish in the top, the top 2/3 every single week. This sounds great. Like, what are you talking about? I can take whoever I want. Like, I don't got to think about somebody getting hurt. I don't got to think about Kyron Williams, none of that. Cause there's only going to be, so many Kyron Williams teams. It's like, actually, this is kind of the opposite, because multiple things that you said. One, this is actually like the second hardest tournament to make it to the finals. Yeah. Best Ball Mania is like probably always going to be the most difficult. It's right. It's the biggest. It's just mathematically probably always going to be the most difficult outside of Best Ball Mania. This is the most difficult from just a straight math, right? Let's run the math about how you get to how many people and how hard it is to get to the week 17 final. This is the second toughest. For example,
I would argue this is tougher from the perspective of, the math is going to say BBM, but I think there's a lot of luck involved in the BBM way that it gets there. And this is harder in terms of your team has to be that dominant. Because as you said, like I said, in week 12, only 2.3% of the field's remaining. In week 13, only 1.3%. And then the last 4 weeks or 3 weeks leading into week 17, you're sub 1%. You're 99th percentile teams only in all of your pods. And you have to beat all of these teams. And I guess that's kind of the way it is in Best Ball Mania in week 15 and week 16. But I guess in my mind, you only have to do that twice. Yeah, exactly.
And so in Best Ball Mania, it's hardest to make it to the final because those pods do get bigger and you have to. So
right.
I wouldn't say that it's, I wouldn't, the math says it's harder in BBM, but I wouldn't say that it's harder necessarily because, like you said, getting week 1 through 14 is one thing, and I only got to get in the top 2 out of 12, as opposed to this is just, sure, it's easier technically on a week-by-week basis, but it gets so much harder every single week, and there's so, like, you're encountering that pod overlay, not overlay, that overlap in the pod teams, like so much quicker every single like
it takes a better team to get to week 15.
It takes a better team
in this
100%.
And
once you get there, it is a little easier in week 15 and 16.
Certainly. Yeah.
But weeks to navigate after week 14 to get to week 15 is significantly harder, significantly harder. So that's the kind of push.
And it's still,
pull, right?
And it's still, the math still offsets it. BBM still harder to get to week 17. We both realize that. But my mindset is like, the luck of week 15 and 16 pods in BBM does play a role as well. There's a lot of variance. Luck, however you want to talk about that. You got to get fortunate to get to the BBM final, obviously, in addition to having a good team. But some of the teams are just running hot for 2 weeks and then they're in. You know what I mean? Like, you can't really just run hot for 8 weeks in a row against the best pods, in the Eliminator. It's too hard.
No, and you can run hot both your team scoring in Best Ball Mania or any of these other tournaments, right? Puppies, DraftKings, whatever. You can run hot in weeks 15 and 16, both from congratulations, Amari Cooper was a shit pick, but he scored 50 in week 16. Now you made the finals. Or you can run hot. Congratulations. This is legitimately what happened to me last year. My one BBM finals team. There's only 2 Amari Cooper teams in week 16 in my pod. And guess what? They both sucked. Both of the teams were not very good. So I did not have Amari Cooper in week 16. My team was very good. It scored well in week 16, but my other teams that were alive in week 16 got wiped out by Amari Cooper teams because there was 4 or 5 of them in all my pods. This one, I just got lucky, right? So the variance played out in my favor in week 16, which is part of that format. That's why that's great. But in this, like, that's going to have to happen to you. Like you said, 8 weeks in a row, like that's going to happen 8 weeks in a row. And then the compound, like, so you don't have Amari Cooper. All right. Amari had the 50-point game in week 9. Okay. You survived, right? 5 teams advanced out of week 9. You survived. There weren't enough teams to totally knock you out. Okay. So now a bunch of guys advanced into that next round. You don't have the next guy. Like how many weeks can you avoid? Right. How many weeks can you avoid the landslide of all these guys coming together?
The other part of that Amari Cooper story is Amari Cooper's not going to be in a lot of week 16. Well, he's not a great
in this format.
He had a decent enough year last year, but there's certain guys.
Mike Evans from 2 years ago, right? Second round, Mike Evans.
Certain guys who won't, or like what Devontae Adams, he actually got into the BBM for some people and had the monster week 17. Like, those guys that are not good picks those eliminator teams are not going to advance. Like, they're not going to be able to get that much pod luck week after week after week after week. They're going to probably go out. I mean, it's obviously possible, but I just think it's going to be hard. I would guess, I don't know. I wonder if there's data on it that the teams will be more concentrated in this format in weeks 15 and 16. And then even in the week 17 final, the player exposures will be more concentrated than in BBM, where it's kind of set up to allow for some variance and the teams look a little bit different. In Eliminator, I feel like, the guys that are consistently studs, the ones that are the top win rate players, are going to probably be on a lot of the teams down the stretch.
I think compared to the playoff format tournaments, it's an interesting kind of thought experiment, because on one hand, someone would say, well, I only got to finish in the top, let's just call it half, right? For easy argument. I only got to finish in the top half. Sure, those guys are going to be, very popular continually as the season goes on, but I could survive without Kyron Williams last year. I could survive without Achane or Mostert last year because, like you said, there's pod variance, and are there really going to be 8 teams in my week 8 pod with Kyron Williams? He's a different example because he wasn't drafted in, but Mostert's a better example because he was drafted in every single draft. Someone would say, I could survive without that, right? Because I just need to not bottom out. We'll get to some of the not bottoming out stuff. But whereas they could say, look, if he's not the guy you need in any specific week, I could survive. But the same thing is also true for weeks 15 and 16. Is like, Kyron was great to have, obviously, in weeks 15 and 16, but he didn't score 45. He didn't do a Amari Cooper type of a situation. So most teams that made the finals didn't have Kyron. He was only 15% despite being the best pick in all of fantasy last year. He was only 15% in the BBM finals. And so I think the compound interest is the people are going to make fun of me because I love a good analogy. And this is becoming a bad bit. Too many analogies are happening around here, but the compound interest one is so true but think about it from that specific player perspective. Is like, yeah, okay, the first few weeks, right? We're weeding out the bottom feeders, we're weeding out those guys, but it's specifically those players that you mentioned, what we would call the league winners: Kyron, Puka, Tank Dell, Mostert, Achane, right? The Jacobs from a couple of years ago, those like Cooper Kupp and Mark Andrews from a couple of years ago, the guys who are just every fucking week, man, just good at a minimum, a good game, a usable week, if you will, but so many big scores that dude by 6, 7, 8, 9, week 10, these guys are just in every starting lineup every single week, that the value of that is not only because they're hitting your lineup every single week, but then when they have their like really good games, it's like, no, that team advanced, like it's over. Like 1 or 2 players advanced. You know, if you had Cooper Kupp and Mark Andrews a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, like you just like you crushed the eliminator because Cooper Kupp is scoring 20 every week and Mark Andrews is scoring 20 every week at the tight end position. That those guys, like they'll be higher owned once we get to week 11, 12, 13, 14 in the eliminator than they will in BBM. You might get around the edges, guys, right? Once we get out of the top 10 guys that are the most impactful, you'll get like, I don't know, Tyler Algier versus Jalen Wright versus Jaleel McLaughlin, like whatever. They're all, that's variance who shows up there. But the top 5, 6, 7, 8 guys, like they're going to be it's not going to be so dependent upon Amari Cooper is the highest owned player in the Best Ball Mania Finals because he went for 50 in week 16. It's going to be the Mosterts and the Kyrans and the Pukas and all that. It's just a different level. It's because of the compound interest thing. You're compounding their benefit over every single week as opposed to needing them to do it in week 15 or week 16 just to get there.
Although it's fascinating because some of those players you mentioned, like Kyron and H, had missed some time. And so, you know, some of their teams that were relying on them might have fallen out at those points in time and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's this contest is such a, you know, do you cuss on this show?
Fucking right, we cuss on this show.
Yeah, all right. It's such a mind fuck. I just wanted to make sure before I said the word. You do a lot of different types of shows. You never really know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, there's so many other things we can talk about. The one thing about the bye weeks, there being 6 teams on bye in week 12 and 6 in week 14, which are the 2 biggest bye weeks, and they're the 2 latest as well. There's no week 13s, and those are the final 2 weeks where a team is on a bye. And there's only 8 weeks where there is a team on a bye, by the way. So there's some math to that where you're like, okay, I got to draft 18 players. There's 8 weeks where there's a team on a bye. So there's like 2.4, I think it is, or 2.3 is the average number of buys per week if you averaged it out perfect. And at first I was like, I want to try to get 2 or 3 players from every week. But then I realized that the field is also going to be tilted to how many players there are or how many teams are on a bye each week. So if I get week 7, week 9 only have 2 teams on a bye, and I like to target those players. It's the Cowboys and Bears in week 7. It's the Steelers and Niners in week 9, because it's hard to fill the week 9 buys, especially because some of those teams, there's not a lot of like late round options that I'm into on like the Steelers and Niners, for example. So I've pushed up the early Niners or like the Jalen Warren. If I don't get an early Niner, like I got to get him, because after that, I'm not drafting a lot of Steelers or Niners into the double-digit rounds. I mean, there's, a couple Steelers. You could draft Freiermuth, whatever. But and then less for the Bears, but similar, I think, for the Cowboys. I'm not drafting I could draft Dowdle, but I'm not drafting a lot of Zeke. I'm not drafting a lot of their later receiving options.
Yeah, Tolbert
I'm not drafting a lot of those dudes. Like the Bears,
not a Jalen Brooks guy, huh?
I'm not a Jalen Brooks guy this year. So I mean, your mileage may vary on some of that. For me, like I do take some Roschon and some Khalil Herbert. So like the Bears, there's layers to the Bears. You can hit them at different spots in the draft. But I was thinking, okay, I want to try to get a couple players on the week 7 or a week 9 bye. And like I built one team that was a Purdy, Kittle, Warren team, and I was like, oh, that's nice. I got 3 week 9 buys. Like I don't need to add any more. But then I realized, like, when week 9 comes around and I have Purdy, Kittle, and Warren all on a bye, most of my pod's not going to have a lot of buys that week because there's only 2 teams on a bye. So the buys are actually going to be, you got to think about, like, your opponents are going to be impacted by buys, related to how many are actually on a bye that week.
Right. How many NFL teams are on the bye? Yeah.
Right. How many NFL
your opponent's teams are going to look like a certain way, obviously depending upon the results. If Jalen Warren is just fucking crushing every single week, he's going to be on a good amount of those teams. But just assume he's not Kyren Williams. He's good, but he's not Kyren Williams. You get to that point, like there's 10 teams in your pod and there's only 2 NFL teams on bye. There's just not going to be that many buys on your opponent's teams.
Right. And then that's what I threw in an aside earlier as I was going through some thoughts, but when you get to week 12, you think about that, all the other buys have been passed, and the people that have a disproportionate number of week 12 or week 14 buys in their build have had most of their roster available for those other games. It's not going to be a massive shift because we're just talking about a couple different players that didn't have one buy, right? Like that's not going to be the only determining factor. But I do think the field will be marginally weighted toward teams that have marginally more week 12 and 14 buys because it was marginally easier for them to get to week 12 and 14 because they had those buys. And there's 6 teams on buys for both of those weeks. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is this idea of playing it as a cash game. If you go out in week 12, you make $50 on your $10 investment. If you go out in week 14, you make $100 on your $10 investment. You 10x. I mean, that's not like something to just scoff at. If you did that in your whole portfolio, you'd feel great about it.
Shit, yeah. I'm putting $1,500 into this. You can tell me I could turn $1,500 into 15 grand. Like, fuck great. Yeah, man.
Like, all my teams go out week 14. I'm thrilled. Like, and so exactly. Like, you know, some of it is like, oh, we can't do the Houston Baltimore stuff because they both have week 14 buys. And they, you know, if I want to try to do that for the week 17 final, my mindset's like, I don't really care. Like, they're 2 really good offenses. I'll go after it. I'm probably not going to make it through week 14. The reality is I'm probably not going to make it to week 14. If I get to week 14, there's going to be some other teams that also have some week 14 buys in my pod. And if I've at least left myself a feasible lineup, like I don't think you should go take Stroud and Lamar and no other quarterback. And you literally don't have a quarterback for week 14. Leave yourself a feasible lineup and some out. Leave yourself the possibility of hitting something. Probably the right way to play that is to build a type of game stack for week 14 cheaply. Like, I don't know who you'd hit on late, but like one of the guys I love in this format, for example, is Daniel Jones. People are really worried about Daniel Jones getting benched late in the season, but with all these formats like this in the marathon with more weight towards the early weeks, they matter more. Just getting to the late part of the season is so hard in this. Daniel Jones is a great play at cost at that point. Like the way that his profile is with some mobility, he scores well. He's a nice guy to add late. If I have like a Malik Neighbors early, I add a Daniel Jones. You know, I don't know who they're playing week 14, but I might build in I'll try to build in a little bit of a game stack in week 14. If I've hammered the week 14 buys and be like, well, if I just get really lucky, I might actually still be able to get through week 14 as well. But for the most part, I'm building this team as if it's going to go out week 14 almost, which is not, there's not something I set out to do in every draft, but some rooms you'll get and the values will push these late buys to you. People start to pick the early buys a little earlier. They're thinking through it. I think people have caught on to the picking the week 7, week 9 buys. They're targeting those guys a little earlier, which I think is fair. They probably should go a little earlier. Like, I don't even like Brandon Ayuk's profile for this contest because it's not so consistent, but he does have the spike week upside that I was talking through it, can actually provide some floor to your weekly builds. Yep. And so I'm taking him in this contest more than I'm taking him in other formats. I'm not super high on him in other formats, but the buy thing is so helpful. And he goes in the early rounds. There's another element to that buy thing where if you build your first 6 or 8 or 10 rounds without any buy issues, you can then take the values as they come later. You can make the picks that you want to make. If you start to build in buy issues in the first half of your draft, then you have to start wondering if certain plays are off the board for you when they fall to you. You're like, I already have too much invested in week 6 is an easy way to do it. Kansas City, the Rams, Miami, and Minnesota. If you start with a Justin Jefferson, Jalen Waddle, and you could hit Cooper Kupp in the 3rd. You could literally start with 3 straight week 6 wide receivers.
Travis Kelce, do that. HN,
right.
All those guys.
And then there's all these other options. You can't go get any Kansas City wide receiver. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to play through that the rest of the way. So you want to think through I think particularly the early part. There's also something I talked about in one of my builds with that like the early drafters are the ones that you're banking on for weekly help. The late options, I don't care so much about their buys because they're probably not hitting my lineup most weeks anyway. I'm only hoping for a few good games out of them. It's more like those guys are on bye 10 weeks. I know one of the weeks are on bye. I don't know the other 9, but they're going to be on bye 9 other weeks, right? Like, but the early round guys where my real volume is, and I know that these players are good, I want to spread out those buys as much as I can so I'm not hammered with like 3 dudes that are out one week that are my best players, because that's probably the week you're going out. You can already kind of handicap yourself against it. So the buy stuff, there's a lot of considerations there. I don't know. I'm sure you have plenty of others that you've thought through.
Yeah, I think the buys is one of the, you definitely have to cover it in this format, and certainly people are on the aren't you worried scale. The bye weeks are probably at the top of the aren't you worried scale in Eliminator for most people. You hit on a ton of it. So first, I wanted to mention, just because I was looking up while you were talking, Daniel Jones and the old New York Giants played the New Orleans Saints in week 14, which is pretty interesting. Also because week 12 is when the Saints are on a bye. And so you can really let's find a week 12 game that we can stack, and pair our week 12 and 14 kind of little game stacks and say, look, I'm probably going to I did Ravens Texans, right? And it's like, okay, I took neighbors with Ravens Texans, and it's like, look, this is probably not going to go well. Week 14.
This is a cash game build.
Yeah. Yep. We built for the 10X. We didn't build for the 100K or whatever. It is what it is. But how do I loved that point that you made. I've admitted by the time week 14 gets here, this team's probably drawing thin, but how do I give myself that out to being like, let's survive this baby with this kind of outlier performance? And Daniel Jones is like one of the shining examples to me of a guy who, and maybe I'm being biased because I'm drafting a bunch of eliminators. It's almost like made me more open to drafting him in other formats. I totally get look. We all get the Russell Wilson contract thing, and the Daniel Jones is not very good at football thing.
I've been doing the same thing because I'm like, okay, but Sean Payton was secure last year. But Brian Daboll's tied to Daniel Jones. He gets fired if he benches him. He's definitely he's got to play him, right?
Then Hard Knocks comes out. And they're like, well, we kicked Saquon to the side because we're paying Daniel Jones $40 million not to hand the ball off. And I'm just like, oh my God, I got to go draft Daniel Jones now. You know what I mean?
Every format now.
Yeah. So I'll fully admit that potential bias, but those kinds of players, from a straight player take perspective, are, I think, some of the best things to do in this format, where it the market is not going to change their take on Daniel Jones. And okay, you might get in a draft where someone, if Ben and I are in the draft with you, maybe Daniel Jones goes a little higher than he would on normal. But on average, right, the ADP is what the ADP is. People are anchored to their Daniel Jones takes, and there's a trickle down effect from the playoff format type stuff. That's just, he's never going to get so expensive. That those are the kinds of guys that I flip over the cards in September and look at my portfolio, and it's like, I'm significantly overweight Daniel Jones in the Eliminator. I'm whatever on him, in my whole best ball portfolio. I'm totally whatever on him. And the bye week stuff. So there's those players. He happens to kind of fit both of these molds. He can be that late guy that is and there's a bunch of these potential type guys that maybe we can talk about, but that can help power you through a lot of this at a cheap cost. And of course, there's the week 12 and week 14 stuff, so you can do you take, like you said, you do your Ravens, Texans, Malik Neighbors, and you're like, oh shit, I got Lamar, I got to figure out a way to give myself a shot to make this final, or, to move to week 16. And so I have Neighbors. Let's do the Daniel Jones, or but plan ahead, right? You get to round 9, and you're like, all right, so I'm planning ahead. What does this look like? Maybe this team, Rashid Shaheed fits better on this team than someone else does.
Miller
right?
or Juwan Johnson were two that popped into my head.
Exactly. So I'm like, all right, I need a second tight end. Let's think. And Juwan could be another good fit for this, where he's plummeting, and we don't know. We assume he's going to be healthy for
he'll
for
be
the
playing
season.
week 14. Yeah, exactly.
His injury right now has no impact on week 14.
Right.
It has an impact on week 1, but we care less about week 1 in this. Maybe you have Mark Andrews on this team. Is if you needed Juwan Johnson in week 1 for your Mark Andrews team, you were probably shit out of luck anyway.
Yeah,
your
team already lost. That's the thing. You got this is a format where you got to draft you're right more than other formats as well.
Yes.
The Mark Andrews thing has to be right. He has to. The thesis where he's getting consistent volume every week and as a tight end 1. In some other formats, like BBM, for example, you can tell yourself about the late round spike week potential, the week 15, 16, and 17 spike week potential. They're good enough to help you with your advance rate, but they're not necessarily consistently dominant all season. They're good. They're the tight end 3 all season, or tight end 5. and then they spike in the fantasy playoffs, and then that's like a league winner for you, right? In this, it's more like I need the Mark Andrews thesis where he's the tight end one because every week he's getting 8 targets. Like it's so consistent and it's so helpful to my build. It doesn't have to be that way, but I want to draft like that. I want to draft like if I took my elite tight end was right. I want to do more of the drafting like I'm right thing. So to your point, it makes perfect sense. That I'll throw Juwan Johnson. I don't want to have to rely on Juwan Johnson early. I'm doing the Lamar Andrews stack. I'm saying that is a defining element of 2024. Because if it's not, my team's not winning the Eliminator anyway. My team has to be that good. It has to be a team that is built with the defining pieces of 2024.
Yeah. And I think part of that is all these different elements that we're talking about here, like the bye week stuff, right, matters. The overlap starts to matter. So like you're saying like why does any of this shit matter? Of course, draft the best players, smooth out your buys or whatever. But like that compounding interest, and then when we get into the buys, is such an underrated element of this tournament where you start, especially I know week 12 and 14, but like as soon as we start to get into the buys, like these seasons play out and like very quickly we know who the like, oh shit, I don't have enough of that guy in my portfolio. Guy, like if you didn't draft any Kyron last year, you knew immediately like, oh, I'm in trouble. Like I'm in big trouble. Right. And Achane wasn't active week 1, but very quickly we learned if we learned Mostert very quickly if you didn't have, right. We learned CD did, if you were worried about CD taking the leap at the 1-2 turn, guess what? We learned real quick, like, yes, Jake Ferguson, Sam Laporta, we learned these things very quickly. So think about all those guys and then think about the teams that have multiple of them, not all of them together. I mean, we want all of them. That's our goal, is to get Laporta and Ferguson and CD and Achane and Kyron and Puka and get all those guys on the same team. But, teams are going to have multiple of them. So then that compounds, and then you hit the buys. And it's like, you have to start building for the teams, like you said, draft like I'm right. Like I have those guys now. This team that I've built has some form of that collection of players, but also my opponents do. Right. A certain percentage of when you mentioned like people talking about building in floor into their teams, I think what's missing is this compounding interest element where it's like, yes, you do need to we need to score a certain level of points every single week to advance. We all acknowledge that. It's in the fucking rules of the tournament.
Well, this is a good point that you're about to make though. And I want to dig into this, but finish your point.
But then I need to score points that my opponents don't have once I've reached a certain point of the season. And we're all having guys, like we draft 18 players, but we're all having guys that are not available to us. So I'm sharing, right? So we get to 10, we get to whatever week, and it's me against 9 other people. Well, the people that have been carrying me to finish in that top 75% or 80% each week, they have them too.
Right.
And then we reach the buys, and like I got 2 guys. So I only have 16 guys and you only have 16 guys, and we share 5 guys. Right. So there's now we're only down to 10 players that are making an impact, and you start trickling it down there. It's like, buddy, the high floor player that you think that you're drafting that's getting you 4 points is not changing anything, because we're actually really talking about like our wide receiver 3 and our flex, and we're like 2v2ing and 3v3ing by the time we get to those weeks, which is like so much harder to advance once you get there, because it's not just like just finish in the top half anymore. It's like, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're sharing so many players. We're like a 3v3, my 3 players against your 3 players once we get to week 9.
And like if you're talking about the week 14 thing, like let's say you did do the Houston Baltimore thing. We were just talking about a scenario where Lamar Andrews is right, and they're so right that a lot of teams are there in week 14 and have it on a bye. And like you said, you're matching some other ancillary pieces probably too, because these are the best teams with some of the other teams in your pod. So how are you different on those other 10 teams, as you said, on your roster? That's where you really, like, people who are hearing us talk about stacking up a week 14 game, or maybe like, is that really going to matter? Well, think through it. Like, you only have 10 other players to differentiate. Would you like those 10 players to be stacked up in that game? You know what I mean? Like, and that's when it's like, that is how that works. The Daniel Jones and Saints thing we were discussing could go a long way for you at that point, when you start to think through what your pod might look like and how there's some match players and there's some buys there. And again, This sounds a little bit overly precise, and a lot of times when we get into this type of stuff, there's more variance than in reality. But you're trying to think through the most likely and how what can I build into my build? What can I think about? What can I prepare my team for? What contingencies can I have in there? And I do think this stuff matters more than some of the other overly precise stuff in other contests. I think the Eliminator is unique like that, where there is so much strategy. That was what we talked about at the very beginning. But the thing that you said about floor does matter, I do want to go back to that because I think that was such an important point as well. I can't remember which of my pieces, but I tried to talk about this where like I like to draft rookies in every format, right? Yeah. But one of the reasons we draft rookies is for back-weighted production. And there are those players like Quentin Johnston last year or Sky Moore the year before who just never hit, and there's zeros in your roster the whole year. But like one of the things you can tell yourself is like, well, if I can get them to the playoffs, you know, the back-weighted production thing will hit. Then there's the other players like Rashee Rice, for example, was a clear hit, and he had some usable weeks early, but he never ran more than 70% of routes on more than 70% of his team's dropbacks until week 14. Like, even though he was really, really good, the Chiefs were kind of bringing him along slowly. A.J. Brown is the example. You go back to his rookie year with the Titans, played 40% of the snaps in his first 4 weeks. Then he was around 60% of the snaps in his next 4 weeks. And then week 9, he played his first, like, real full snap share. Even though he was clearly a stud, they were bringing him along slowly. He was like the wide receiver 2 overall the rest of the season down the stretch. He was an absolute star. Amon-Ra St. Brown, absolutely elite down the stretch in his rookie year. These are the reasons a lot of the times that we're drafting rookies. It's not the only way it can play out. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, those guys were studs from day one. But I will say, even as a card carrying, I draft rookies everywhere. In the Eliminator, I'm marginally less likely to, because of those types of examples I just gave, the A.J. Brown, the Amon-Ra St. Brown ones, where the floor throughout the first half of the year can be low, even for the ones that are massive hits in our and all of the analysis that we've done over the years. And their ADPs in the Eliminator are still reflecting these guys could be massively back-weighted production. I certainly don't want to stack too many of them into a build. Like Xavier Worthy's a guy I draft. I think he's my highest drafted receiver. I try to avoid him in the Eliminator because he's a guy that I think could be brought along slowly. Now, Rashee Rice's suspension will depend, but I just mentioned Rice being brought along slowly. Sky Moore was brought along slowly as a rookie. Andy Reid has a history with rookies of doing that. Now, with Rashee Rice's suspension, could be different for Xavier Worthy. I don't want to make him the only example here.
Don't worry, it is Justin a really Watson's still there. Andy's got Justin Watson to run 80% of the routes.
He's going to do that because he's thinking about the Super Bowl. He's thinking about game 21. He's not thinking about week 17 as the end of his season. We are in fantasy. Right. He's thinking that's why he got Rashee Rice into a full role by week 14 and gave him 4 games before the playoffs and then gave him 4 full games in the playoffs. Rashee Rice still ran 8 games as a full-time player last year, but it impacted us in fantasy a lot less. And that's the way you got to think about what the coach is thinking, what his goals are. There's other teams that are not in the same situation as the Chiefs where they know they're going to be in the playoffs. They're not in a rush to speed these guys up. Andy Reid's been doing that a lot more in the last few years. He even talked about with Travis Kelce. Kelce ran the fewest routes since like 2017 or something last year, or his fewest route since 2017. And Reid talked about that was intentional. They were saving him for the playoffs to a certain degree. So those are, with the rookies, to finish that point, you were talking about like the floor does matter. When I get into that decision point in certain points in the draft, like for example, it was often the 7th round. It's more like the 6th round now, but there's a pocket of 3 veteran receivers I really like: JSN, Rashee Rice, and Deontay Johnson. And I was getting a lot less Deontay Johnson because I was taking a shit ton of Rashee Rice because I knew his price was going to rise. But if Rashee Rice gets an 8-game suspension, we just talked about this, like 10% of the Eliminator teams are going to be alive in week 9. You think you're going to be one of those if you drafted Rashee Rice? I mean, that's a tough gamble to make. I'm probably not taking Rashee Rice in this format or the injury return guys, the TJ Hawkinses and the Nick Chubbs and stuff. Yeah. It's going to be very, very different. I mean, I know those guys are already discounted, but they're just off my board. I want floor plus ceiling is where I'm going with this whole point. Deontay Johnson's an example of that to me, where like I feel comfortable at the floor, but I also think this guy still has ceiling in the efficiency side. If he did have an efficiency season, he's such a good target earner. This is my personal take on Deontay. Some people don't think he has the real ceiling, but there are other examples of this. I took a lot of David Montgomery in the Eliminator. He has ceiling contingency based. If Jahmyr Gibbs goes out, I don't think we talk about this enough with David Montgomery. I think he has a really stable floor as a 0 RB, RB1. He's going to play. He's going to get some goal line work. He's got a week 5 bye as well, which is helpful for this format. We talked about you do probably want the early buys. He's a nice pick for this format where I do feel good about his guaranteed touches. They're not going to, like, there's some guaranteed touches the guy can get beat out. They're not, Craig Reynolds is not beating out David Montgomery. He's going to maintain his role. And then he does have some real ceiling in addition to that. So it's, for me, it's less about like, you know, Trey Benson goes not much longer than that. Well, Trey Benson might not play for the first 8 weeks. David Montgomery is going to play and then has some ceiling if it were to be a contingent based thing where Jahmyr Gibbs missed some time. So I am prioritizing floor in that regard, as long as I don't have to give up a ceiling path that I'm able to tell myself. I'm taking more veterans in the Eliminator for that reason, but I'm not taking bad veterans. I'm not taking old running backs where I'm like, oh, this guy has a role. Like, I'm not drafting Zeke Elliott. Like, yeah, I do think Zeke Elliott's getting a lot of volume, but he's not going to score. Like, even in his good games, he's not going to really score enough to keep me from getting eliminated if other pieces in my roster don't do it.
You didn't lose 35 points. You lost 18 points.
You lost 8. And like,
the difference between that's actually a like sneakily really important thing. We'll get to that. So I want to talk about the rookies and David Montgomery thing, and then we'll touch on the scoring element, because it's like, it's huge. Like I think in general in best ball, but definitely in this format, people like, what did you call it? The like, you know, how the shape of fantasy points or whatever, like how fantasy points are scored, and like what that means on a week to week basis when we're trying to finish in the top half. It's like, I think it's like people, again, I mentioned Samaje Perine, 2 Samaje Perine references in 50 minutes. Like, people think about floor like this old veteran who's gonna, you know, he's the 3rd down back on this shitty offense. Like, that's my high floor. It's like, not really. And maybe in a vacuum, that individual player may have a higher floor than Trey Benson does, right, in week 1. But I'm trying to build out the floor of my team. My collection of 18 players need to have a high floor, not that individual like, he has a high floor relative to running backs because he's probably going to score 4 points more frequently than Trey Benson is going to score 4 points. But 4 points is not adding a high floor to my team, right? It doesn't help me, because I can just draft 6 or 7 running backs and get a floor of 4. Like, you know, one of them's probably going to score a touchdown. Like, there's 6. You know, like I don't need to build in that kind of a floor. But the David Montgomery thing and just the player take aspect, I think, is so important. So I don't know how, you know, and you and I are both like a little more player take guys, but I have become a little more of like, I honestly, in overall best ball, like Best Ball Mania, I honestly only have like a small subset of players where like I'm like pounding the table either for or against. Even more so on the against side, where like I just don't draft that guy. Like, there's not that many that I'm like, I get into a draft and like I'm like, literally I'm going to draft. The folks in the Spike Week Discord call it kind of funny. They call it the Thielen list, because Thielen was a guy last year which clearly worked out awesome. Was a guy that I was like, I don't care what the price is. He's not on
That's me and Zeke this year. It's like, I understand that he's going to get more work than I want, and I'm still not going to draft him.
I just scroll past the name, right? Oh, pick 212, Adam Thielen, and you need a wide receiver. Tough shit, you know. Come on down, Cedric Tillman. You know, like it's like it's like I just scrolled past it, and like we joke about it because like we were wrong, obviously, with that, but he was the player that it was like, it honestly doesn't matter. He's not on my board. There are some of those, but that list has gotten really short for me. And on the flip side, that the players that I'm like pounding the table, like gotta draft, like I'm like obsessed with this player, I want to get way overexposed, is also a small list. So in Best Ball Mania, like I'm not really that picky, choosy. I actually think in the Eliminator is the spot where it's like, be picky and choosy. And if you're like you said, like you love Xavier Worthy because of his playoff upside and his upside with Patrick Mahomes, but you're a little worried about the floor and you're a little worried, like, is he the next guy more? And or Kadarius Toney or whatever. Like, who the hell says you have to draft him in the Eliminator? Go draft him in BBM, because you can win in multiple different ways in BBM. In the Eliminator, if Xavier Worthy is a miss, guess what? You maybe make it to week 3 or whatever on that team. In BB, you could make the fucking finals with Xavier Worthy on your team. I made the finals with JSN, dude, last year. I made the finals with 5th round JSN on. And
this is the thing where this is the part where people who don't like concentrated player takes will be like, well, aren't you afraid that all your teams are going to lose anyway? And I'm like, I'm already afraid that all my Eliminator teams are not going to make it to week 5. You should be too.
It's true. Yeah.
You should be too. So like one of the ways that Jacob Sanderson put it recently that I really liked in talking about BBM was like, you can talk about all your exposures, etc., but you're hoping to wake up in week 17 with one team, and then all your player exposures are 100%, right? So like, does it matter if those guys were 80% at the beginning of your drafts or 20% or whatever? Ultimately, it's like, who do you want to have with you when you're there in week 17? That one. Well, in Eliminator, I'm thinking like, hopefully 10% of my teams make it to week 8, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
I mean, it really, like, if I think David Montgomery is the right play in this format, I have no issue being like, that's my Eliminator play. And if David Montgomery tears his ACL week 1, well, then I just probably not going to do great in the Eliminator this year, but I'm also probably not going to anyway. Because, I mean, I started this saying that there's like this big plus EV in this contest, and I do believe that. I think strategically speaking, you think through a lot of these things that we're talking about and we'll continue to talk about, that there is ways that you can build teams that will just be better situated than most of the field. You can create a bigger gap on the field than in contests like BBM. I truly believe that. But as you just said, it is a format where you kind of want to have some player takes. You kind of want to have some stronger exposures. 2 other veterans in that range, because we talked about a 0 RB that I wrote about, I was just skimming through when I talked about the stability plus upside players, are 2 guys that their prices only make sense if they're going to get hurt. And it's James Conner and Raheem Mostert here. I forgot I was still sharing this, so you pulled it up. James Conner and Raheem Mostert are highlighted in this section of this piece. And this piece is free, by the way. Both of my Eliminator pieces I made free. You can go to bengretch.substack.com and read them if you'd like to.
I'll put the link in the description.
Yeah. Would absolutely love that. James Conner and Mostert, to me, Mostert especially, I wrote on here, is an 8th round pick. He led the NFL with 21 TDs last year. Like, if he doesn't get hurt, it's hard to imagine he's not a win there. But people are playing that Mostert's going to miss some time at age 32. But that's a stability plus upside play for me in a different way, in a weird way, where it's like, well, I think I'm going to get production from week 1 out of him, which is a big part of the Eliminator discussion. And I think Raheem Mostert in the Miami offense can score 20 touchdowns because he fucking did it last year. Like, I don't think that's crazy.
They're better. They're better on offense now. They have more weapons in a better spot.
Yeah,
they're much better. Yeah,
it's certainly
there's no
possible.
River Craycraft and Chosen Anderson out there running routes anymore.
So you're telling me the upside case for Raheem Mostert is that he just doesn't have a catastrophic injury, and then he's a smash in this format. And similar to James Conner, who's coming off the best season of his career in multiple ways: yards per carry, rushing yards. He had his first 1,000-yard rushing season last year. I know he's an older back, but he also had the best missed tackles forced per touch of his career last year. Like, some of the advanced metrics look great. Yards after contact per attempt, I think, was the 2nd best of his career. He looked good and fresh last year, and every report out of Arizona is like, if he stays healthy, he's the starter and Trey Benson's his backup. It sounds like Trey Benson's very much a contingency play, which I think you can still take Trey Benson in a lot of different formats because of that. But, and I wrote in this paragraph here, where Trey Benson's your classic anti-fragile bet in that way. But in the Eliminator, James Conner is the bet that fits where I'm like, okay, he's priced down because of injury risk, but I get week 1 guaranteed touches at a cheap price. And the bet is, if he just stays healthy, I actually have the potential for a pretty decent season-long win if he has another strong rushing efficiency season. The difference between, and people will be like, well, you're not on Zeke, you just hate Zeke. The difference between Zeke and Conner and Mostert is Conner and Mostert did it last year. It's when you start to see the efficiency fall that I'm out on the older backs. These guys were both still good last year. Ezekiel Elliott's missed tackles forced per touch and yards after contact per attempt, and those things they've been declining over multiple years, and they were still very bad. I think they bounced back a little bit from 2022, but they were much worse than his prime. For Conner, it was the best season of his career, and this guy's been productive at other times in his career. For Mostert, he literally had 19 career touchdowns before last year. Then he had 21 in last season. He had more than the rest of his career combined. There's no question that Mostert's prime would be considered last season and maybe this season. Yeah. It's not like we're chasing something they did when he was 25 like we are with Zeke a little bit. And so it's a different conversation. So these types of older players I'm willing to bet on if I do think the efficiency can be there and the situation is set up well enough that they can score over the course of a season. Doesn't mean I'm actively seeking a certain type of player. Another one I've heard is Gus Edwards. And I'm like, Gus Edwards, we started to see a little bit of a decline last year. I'm concerned about Gus Edwards. I think you could play him, but I'm a little worried. For me, he falls more into the Zeke side of it. But I do think that the Chargers situation is an intriguing one to play, and they're by. I don't know. You're nodding. I don't know. Are you in on Gus Edwards or?
So I was nodding because I just had this realization while you were talking that is so counterintuitive. I think the premise of Eliminator is that everything is so counterintuitive to what we would naturally think, and you're outlining Zeke. and Gus Edwards, two players who I really don't like, which should not be a shocker to anyone. I'm an ageist and anti-running back, so that those two guys don't fit don't fit the mold very well at all. But I have been taking Zeke and Gus Edwards in traditional play, Best Ball Mania, Puppies, all these billion tournaments that are out there. And it's counterintuitive because you would say, well, those guys don't reek of the playoff upside and all that, and like, oh, that seems like the kind of eliminator guy, right? The dusty veteran who gets volume at the beginning of the season. But in the playoff formats, especially when we draft the way that we do, like a zero running back principles. I don't want to say just zero running back, but kind of zero running back principles. I inherently know that the people who draft the way that I do are not putting Zeke and Gus Edwards onto those teams. And is Zeke ever going to have
a lot of research to back that up? That's not just anecdotal.
You and I talked about this, I don't know, in February or March or something like that. We did kind of a zero running back show, and our Billy Jones, Hayden has done it. Other people have done the research where it's like, no, like the zero running back bros draft good zero running back teams, but they draft the same they all draft the same, Zeke's not on there. It's Jaylen Warren, right? Jaylen Warren's kind of the poster boy for it. Chase Brown probably will be this year is my expectation, that zero running back people draft the same kind of running backs on the same zero running back teams. And so when in a playoff format, I just need to finish top 2 out of 12 and like luck box my way through this little gauntlet thing. Like I don't really care that much about, this veteran type of worry about I just need to know when you're out there in Eliminator, like you said, do I know that you're like good or can be good, or like you're way too cheap for what your week 1 role looks like? And your talent, that's Mostert and Connor to me. Zeke and Gus are just like, Jesus Christ, I'm just taking the
But you can tell yourself that they could score 2 touchdowns in weeks 15, 16, or 17. Just not for the whole season.
It's just not a good whole season bet. It's not a good whole season bet to me. But I can say I don't need Zeke to be a good whole season bet. Just like give me a couple of usable weeks through the course of the year to bide my time, and then poof, week 17 against the Eagles, 2 touchdowns. Yeah. Get lucky and back those TDs. And guess what? Zero running back was a win. Lamar Andrews was a win. Like we just like, it was Lamar Andrews and Tank. I'm drafting that. Cool. And then, but guess what? Nobody showed up with that group of players and Zeke, because they took Chase Brown and they took Zach Charbonnet and Ty Chandler. And I showed up with Zeke, and it was like, cool, I win through that, right? It's like in DFS, I swap out the chalky, sexy wide receiver for the Tyler Boyd or that's whatever, exactly. And and he happens to have that good week. That's the element in the playoff stuff. In this, I don't give a fuck about that. Like I'm not interested in that element of it. I want the underpriced assets for this format, and it is the David Montgomerys and the Raheem Mosterts and the James Connors, and I'm still drafting some of the, I'm still drafting some of my other. I'm not drafting Jaylen Warren or whatever in this format. I'm not drafting Chase Brown, but my player takes do shift a little bit, and they also become a little more pronounced. Where Jonathan Brooks, buddy, I kind of like you, but like Jonathan Brooks versus James Conner. Jonathan Brooks versus James Conner and Raheem Mostert and David Montgomery at the same price in this tournament, like he's not that same level of bet for me. So it is
maybe
funny.
Took him in 1, but yeah, it's tough to take Brooks in the Eliminator.
As you were taught, like I need and so maybe I do have Kyron on my Brooks team, or I did start I did start something a little bit different. But the whole player, like as you were saying, I think the player takes stuff feels counterintuitive. Just like honestly, everything feels counterintuitive in the Eliminator, where it's like, you're telling me it's the hardest tournament to keep advancing and the hardest tournament to make the finals, but then my player tastes are like the opposite of what you would think. That mind, right? It's so hard to make the finals. It's so hard to navigate this thing. I need that upside, rookie juice, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, actually, the upside cases that are most viable in this are just like, Mostert is just Mostert, dude. And we discounted him because of all, the Achane and Jalen Wright concerns. And it was like, we were wrong about that. He shouldn't have been picked at pick 100. That's still an upside case. It's just in like Best Ball Mania, that upside case is harder to navigate your way all the way there. Whereas in this one, it's like, I could be wrong about that and still have an awesome eliminator team. And if it hits, he's the best pick in the whole eliminator.
Right. I mean, I don't think you only want to take those backs, because you do have to remember that chaos is the rule and all of that stuff. Like I was talking about Benson. Benson's cost is a little more expensive than Jalen Wright, but I did mention in this paragraph, I wrote Jalen Wright's another massive anti-fragile bet like Benson I had mentioned. And I've been willing to make that bet on some eliminator teams after ADP because he can still be huge. And the idea being, like, if Mostert does go out in week 1, then Jalen Wright actually will be right in the eliminator because he'll be so cheap, and that can happen at running back. I went on to talk about, for people who are curious about other positions, that these types of bets are harder to delineate at other positions, which are more talent-based. I had mentioned Josh Palmer earlier, and I said, and he and probably more realistically Quentin Johnston are good examples of this. I went on to say, am I betting on QJ to break out in 2024? Not really. And he could be a problem for some of my eliminator builds. But if I'm going to take him in some format, this is one where his week 5 bye is helpful. And I do think his expected role provides some weekly help, and that it could be the difference between me taking a 0 in a given week that might lead to me being eliminated. The point being, I do think start of the year, he's going to run plenty of routes. And the bet on Quentin Johnston, if he's right, if he actually hits, is not a playing time based bet. We're all actually taking him a lot later than probably his projected role, because we're pretty confident he sucks. He had a really tough rookie year. But if you're going to take a Quentin Johnston bet at some point, you have the routes there. And if he does actually reverse the trends of last year, now you have the solid volume all year. It's that same concept of what did I call this? The stability plus upside players. Like,
I love that.
Stability at receiver for me would be about routes. And it's guys that have routes roles that are priced down due to talent, but might still have an upside case to be made, like Quentin Johnston. This does not mean Adam Thielen, because I think we can be pretty confident that Adam Thielen does not have, an upside case to be made at this point in his career. Even last year, it was mostly routes based. He ran the 4th most routes in the NFL. He didn't actually see his peripherals jump way back or anything like that. So again, not just cherry picking and not just picking on Adam Thielen and Zeke and these old guys. It's the old guys who don't actually have the efficiency anymore in their profile. The young guys like a QJ, where you're like, okay, I think the routes can be there. And then also he has the nice buy. Like, okay, I've taken him if I need another receiver late. But like I said, most of my structures in this format are early receiver. I like to get 2 early tight ends because then I can quit at 2. A lot of people talked about the 3 QB, 3 tight end builds. I like that, but you also get thin at running back and receiver. You need depth there through the buys as well. I think 3 QBs is way more important to prioritize than 3 tight ends, because tight ends floor is lower. It's okay if you take a 0. You're not going to necessarily die for sure.
Right. Or a 2, that 4 from P. Ryan that I was talking about earlier, you get that 2 at tight end. Like, you can still easily finish in the top part of it. Yeah.
You can survive from a floor perspective, but I do like to go for the elites there, because I think getting points out of tight end every week can be a boost that other people in your pod might not have. Like, meaningful points throughout the season, consistent target volume,
and with less roster spots. Right. And spending less,
and then it frees up a roster spot. And the 3 QB thing, a big part of that is if you stack them all, if you make sure to stack them all, you have these little weekly spike week potential all throughout 3 different paths to that. Right. And so you know, and then one of the things I wrote about in my 6 more keynotes as well was this idea of divisional bringbacks as well. And a big part here is all week 18 games are divisional. So every team has 3 other teams in their division. One of them, they're only playing once in the actual eliminator season through week 17. So you got to look that up. Like, who's the team in their division that they're playing week 18? That's not the divisional bringback you're talking about. The example I use here, I believe, is the Chargers. No, it's the Broncos, but they play. So the Broncos play. I like to do Bo Nick stuff late. The Broncos play the Chiefs in week 18. So they only play the Chiefs once in the fantasy relevant weeks, but they play the Raiders in weeks 5 and 12. They play the Chargers in weeks 6 and 16. So if I have my example here is if I have a Bo Nick stack with another Bronco or a couple Broncos, he's really easy to stack late with Marvin Mims or Troy Franklin. And I also had a guy like Josh Palmer and Brock Bowers on the roster. Say I had both those guys on the roster. Now I have a Bo Nick stack with a bringback twice against the Raiders and twice against the Chargers built into my season. And so it's little things like that, again, where it's like, How do you get floor? Well, you need ceiling as well. Like it's a little bit like the weekly winners almost, where the way people think through it, although you want it to be not just specific weeks for the weekly winners, you want to be able to have it every week. But the idea of building these little divisional bringbacks and multiple little game stacks throughout your eliminator thing is hopefully it aligns, right? Hopefully it aligns the week where you have some other stuff go poorly for you. I talk in this section as well. If I had a lot of week 5 or week 12 buys, I'd really want that Broncos with the Raiders bring back, like we talked about earlier with the Giants and Saints example, if you're doing the week 14 thing.
Yeah.
If I have a bunch of other buys, I want a little game stack into my build for that week that I have all those other buys. Yeah, so this just gives you upside to save you in a week where other things are going bad. And I know people are like, well, how can you assume that it's going to go that way? Well, it certainly can't go that way if you don't build in some ceiling and some some spike week potential. And the other thing is you can't assume it, but it's the same thing. I go back all the time, Eric, to the team that you and Pete built that first year of whatever, BBM2 that finished like top 10 or whatever, because it had this running back room that flowed together so well. It had Rashad Penny late and Sony Michel late. It had other guys, I think James Conner and Raheem Mostert or whatever. Raheem Mostert got hurt, but you guys had him. Guys that
like his first touch of the season. How the fuck did that team get 8th in Best Ball Mania?
But
Raheem Mostert
you had some
hurt,
spike weeks from Alexander Madison. I remember you had on that
Pollard.
team throughout, and it helped you get the points early, middle, and late. And so did you guys know that that's where you're going to get all the points? No, those guys could have all had their spike weeks the same week, and then you would have been fucked. But the point is, like, that's one of the bets you have to make is like, okay, like I'm drafting in a way that I know that there's spike week potential in these players, and I kind of hope the puzzle piece fits together. I think you have to do that a little bit in the eliminator as well. Build as much of the correlation and the spike week potentials and these little mini game stacks into your lineup as you can. These divisional bringbacks to your quarterback stacks is a great way to do it. And then hopefully you hit on one of those a week where the rest of your team's kind of weak, and it's the thing that gets you through that week. I mean, you hope that the puzzle pieces fit together for you.
That is, I mean, we could have just stopped right there from that. Honestly, it was all best ball, but it's obviously very applicable to the eliminator. But the I think you've called it blending or layering of kind of the scoring is. It's kind of the whole fucking game of best ball. It's like the layering of how scores come together. Like what we would classify as the best team. So I love this thought experiment constantly. And there's a lot of thought experiments I like because I'm a fucking weirdo. But if we knew the week 17 points right now, we knew, like, give us all the box scores, give us all the fantasy points that happened in week 17. Could you draft the winning teams in these tournaments? And like the normal person is just like, well, yeah, fucking, of course I could, like I know and it's like, could you though?
Yeah,
like, you got to get there, right? Like
tougher than you think. Yeah.
Because it's not gonna. I will almost guarantee if you just draft the highest scoring players from week 17, you're not going to get there. You're not going to get there. Like if you look week 17 last year, sure, Kyron was good, Pacheco was good, Connor, Jerome Ford, Najee.
I would
Khalil
say that
Herbert.
It's like 10% that you actually even get there. Because like, I mean, it's
at best maybe
you gotta win your week 15 and 16 pools, and you didn't say we get to know the week 15 and 16 scores.
No,
I mean that's fucking hard.
Amari,
how are you gonna know to bring Amari along?
Amari, 0. He didn't fucking play in week 17. Christian McCaffrey. Guess what? Christian McCaffrey and CD. So you would have said, okay, CeeDee Lamb, cool. But like basically last year, you either needed Christian McCaffrey or CeeDee Lamb. The rest of the first round was wiped out in terms of winning a best ball tournament. It was very binary. And I'm speaking, I'm speaking a little bit binary, but that's kind of what it was. You showed up to the final with CMC, or you showed up with CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah, so naturally Tyreek teams all year that didn't get there.
Yeah, exactly. Like Jefferson was great when he played, but he didn't play enough. And Chase stunk. And AJ Brown was good and then died. Really, the Eagles died that painful death down the stretch. And Tyreek Hill was the greatest. Tyreek Hill was better than CeeDee Lamb, but guess what? He just kind of died off at the end of the year. So you needed one of those two guys. And then guess what? CMC got hurt in week 17. So it was all CeeDee Lamb. So anyway, this whole thought experiment thing is you're layering stuff. And I promise I'm not patting you on the back just because you waxed poetic about Pete and I's team, which is like, that team is one of the, maybe the single greatest accomplishment. I feel like maybe, no, I'm not trying to speak for minimize anything Pete has done, but like that team, it didn't win anything. It got 8th for 25 grand or something like that in Best Ball Mania. But it literally did have kind of all of the elements that we talk about, like building into our best ball teams. And then we did, like, we even did we pulled up Devontae Adams, and like, we're all live on the draft stream and people are like, what are you doing? You can't draft Devontae Adams second overall. You know, you can't do this. You can't do that. Kyle Pitts, what are you guys, crazy? Kyle Pitts at the, you know, whatever his cost was that year. And it's like, Sony Michel, he's going to get cut by the Patriots. You're taking Sony Michel in the 18th round. And he was like just a great pick. And so people hated Rashad Penny that year. We just didn't have Amon-Ra, really was the only thing that hurt us. And so it had all those things, but the biggest thing is what you hit on. It just so happened to layer in all of this stuff. And people say, well, how do you predict that? You can't predict exactly how on any one individual team, but you can build a portfolio of teams that do exactly what you said, where
when it's the type of players you drafted,
it's the type of players.
It's a great example of the concept of you make your own luck, which I don't even necessarily love that. But you guys didn't just back into that layering. It's because of how you drafted that running back room that you massively increased the possibility that could occur.
Exactly.
And then it did. You know,
yes, I mean, exactly. And that's the eliminator thing, is what you said, putting together the pieces where, like, I'm not just like, oh no, I need early running, you know, to the Samaje Perine thing, which would be like the Zeke or whatever, right? Like, oh no, I'm drafting a 0 running back team. I need my early running back production. I got to have Zeke and Gus Edwards on this team. It's layering. And I'm not to say that I don't want to make it an anti-Zeke and Gus Edwards thing, because I think whatever, they're fine. But it is, like you said, when they have ceiling cases. So like you mentioned on that team, there's Raheem Mostert, who's like an ambiguous, you know, was it in an ambiguous backfield? That was with Trey Sermon's rookie year, which was actually Eli Mitchell's rookie year. And, you know, so it was like, who is the 49? We think Mostert's like kind of the starter. Obviously, he didn't work out. But then there's Alexander Madison, who was straight handcuff, like
yep,
absolutely of no value unless Dalvin Cook is out. But if Dalvin Cook is out, this is a top
spike
5, top 10. You're getting those big spike weeks, right? Sony Michel is the last round punt. So like, don't punt it off. We used to punt it off. You probably remember this with the James Whites and the JD McKissicks. And it's like, I'm not saying those guys don't have a place, Dylan Laube or whatever, but like, punt it off with the things that all fit together. You're putting this puzzle together that is like, right, okay, James Conner, Mostert, you know, whatever. I did draft Zeke, and it's like, all right, now it's like Tyler Algier. Like, Tyler Algier, come on down to this team, because it's like, okay, now this profile, they fit together. It's like Tyler Algier is probably not, you know, scoring a whole bunch of points to start the season. But when Tyler Algier comes together, like you mentioned with Jalen Wright, like, I'm not fading those guys because there's a case that they fit into this team. That layering effect comes in where Tyler Algier is like, we could be wrong. Like, Bijan's not playing 95% of snaps, it's still like 70-30, and you pop a couple Tyler Algier touchdowns. Or, of course, chaos plays out and Bijan Robinson goes down. And guess what Tyler Algier is when Bijan Robinson is not out there? An incredible fantasy back that's providing you those spike weeks. So it's like this weird combination of all the player take stuff that we talked about, this like layering effect, the structural effect. And I think Eliminator, it just so happens to be like the one place where, like, I feel the most, like, I don't even know what the right word is, but I feel like the most empowered to go like, no, like, I believe these edges exist so much more in this. Whereas like I said, I don't like Zeke. I don't like Gus Edwards, but I'm taking them in Best Ball Mania. I'm taking them in the puppies and all that kind of stuff.
The Sony Michel thing, as you were talking about it, it was reminding me, and people were like mad at you about that. It was reminding me of, I've been kind of touting Trey Sermon recently, where I just did my Colts projection. They're going to be very run heavy. Anthony Richardson's going to help the rushing efficiency of these backs. Sermon looks like a pure handcuff, but I don't think people realize he had the most carries of every other back that's on the roster last year, 35 carries, and had a 4.6 yards per carry last year. Was actually like kind of solid, better than like Evan Hull and Goodson and the other dudes that are on the, I mean, obviously Zach Moss was there too, but he's gone now. And also that Philly brought him in when Steichen was still the OC there, and then Steichen brought him over to Indy last year, and then he was like the next back up last year. And the beats are talking about him like he's the clear number 2. If Jonathan Taylor goes down, like, you're going to be glad you use that 18th round pick on Trey Sermon. I'm just going to say that. But like, I've been getting like, I've mentioned him on some shows, and people are like, "Oh my God, Gretch is touting Trey Sermon now. Can the season get here?" And it's like, I mean, I get that, but you just mentioned Trey Sermon's name in a different context, and I was
it was
like,
an 8th
oh,
round
man.
pick that year, by the way. So the funny how things changed. That
I know
Trey Sermon and Raheem Mostert went in the 7th and 8th round.
We are now certain as a fantasy community that Trey Sermon is so bad that I can't even say that he's worth mixing in the 18th round.
When he never gets picked. Yeah, like he's like 5% drafted, and you're not even allowed to bring his name up. That's how crazy
right.
Things have changed. But
the one thing I was gonna say, it's, as we were talking through the Eliminator stuff, something else that popped into my mind that I wanted to mention earlier. We're talking about how it's these best teams that are gonna win this thing, and when we're thinking about the types of teams and what their actual structure is that wins, the team that keeps popping up into my mind is the team that won the regular season $1 million last year in BBM. They obviously had the big prize for the regular season, then they had the playoff prizes as well. And the regular season team was a 0 RB team. It's very similar to the team that Erik has stepped away. He's away from the keyboard, but that Erik was just talking about, where it was a 0 RB build, and even the first running backs that were taken weren't the most productive. So like the team that he and Pete had, Mostert was, I think, their first running back taken and got hurt in week 1. And this build still worked. The team that won the regular season title last year had, I think it was like AJ Dillon or something as the first running back taken, but had Raheem Mostert and Kyron Williams late. So all of there were the two huge win rate players. But the reason I'm mentioning that particular build is that I was talking about the team that's going to win the Eliminator early on is going to be one of the best possible teams you can envision. That's going to be so good every single week and score a ton of points. Yeah. And that team that actually won the regular season title is a team that was able to score enough points throughout the whole time. They would have still been there at week 15 in the Eliminator. They didn't go on to win BBM last year, but they would have still been there, I assume. I mean, maybe they had one floor week, but to beat out every other team in total points over the first 14 weeks requires basically strong weeks every single week. And that would have made
I'd bet a lot of money they would have made the final. They wouldn't have won the final, but they may not have won the final, but they probably would have made the final, like you said.
In the Eliminator,
scored that many regular in the Eliminator, yes. To score that many points over the course of the regular season, that it's I would doubt they like really bottomed out at any point.
And so the point is, that's what you should be shooting for, is the team that scores the most total points through the first 14 games. Like the team that is structured in such a way that it's not just, oh, I have good picks in different spots. It's that he had the perfect structure as well. 0 RB was the right move with the receivers he had taken. I can't remember the whole roster other than the 0 RB element, because he was able to hit on both Mostert and Kyron. And we know that 0 RB leads to the really, really extreme ceilings. If you hit on both of those types of plays, those running backs in a year like last year was, it doesn't matter that Christian McCaffrey was a superstar too. You couldn't have paired Christian McCaffrey with a receiver. I mean, you could have with Puka, I guess. So maybe this isn't a great point, but there wasn't two Pukas. There wasn't
the 2v2 or 3v3 was better with CeeDee Lamb or Tyreek Hill and Kyron,
the late running back. And structurally getting the early running backs. I mean, early receivers, when you do a 0 RB build and you have the contingency. Again, we talk about the layered scoring at running back. It's even more true at receiver when you build a lot of early receiver depth because of the spike week potential of receiver scoring, where you're able to get a lot of receiver points every week and they're coming from different guys, right? Yes. But like it's the layering, but it's all the good, like you put a lot of capital in and it's all these good receivers. So anyway, I always think back to that team when I think about the Eliminator, because I'm like, I want the team that can score the most points over the first like 14 games. And I know for like a lot of people that may seem like a pipe dream, but like that should be your goal. The closest thing I can think of to doing it is in Scott Fishbowl one year, I had a team that was like leading the overall Scott Fishbowl like 5 of the first 10 weeks or something. And it was the year Cooper went nuclear, and I had Cooper Kupp and I had Deebo Samuel who went nuclear, and my structure was right. And I had that feeling of this team was like, this is just right. I have the right player from every round.
You clicked the starting lineup, like enter your starting lineup, and you were just like, yeah, this team's going to
every week I'm just smiling. I'm like, I love this team. This is exactly right. You could not tell me that there's one guy I should have drafted differently or whatever. And that was also a 0 RB team for the record. And I hit on some good running back points later on. that doesn't mean it has to be 0 RB, but the idea, the principles of 0 RB, the idea of building a lot of contingency at receiver and getting a lot of good receivers early, I do think is even more important for your floor in Eliminator. We talk about that when we talk about 0 RB, even in like season-long leagues. If you're in a home league, you want to run 0 RB. If you really commit to it and you get enough good receivers, and a lot of people will kind of get scared, and we've talked about this before, they'll start drafting running backs in like round 5. Like, that's not really 0 RB. That's like
you got scared and drafted Rashad White. Yeah, you got scared. And
that's not. You didn't get enough firepower at the other positions to justify not taking an early running back anyway. So the point of doing it is to get enough firepower at every other position. That if you do that in your home league, if you never do hit on a running back, we always talk about this. Like, you're probably still going to finish like 6th. Like, unless you just get like a bunch of injuries and a bunch of busts. But it's one of these like higher floor things. The real floor in home leagues is when I'm going to draft 3 or 4 running backs early. Well, I mean, you can start to stack bust risk really quickly, and then you finish dead last. It's, again, similar to the Eliminator here, or my mindset in the Eliminator. I want to have the early receiver depth. I want to be building in some upside at QB and tight end where I can. We talked about the 3 QB thing. If I can do 2 tight ends, I can open up more spots in my build for another running back or another receiver, which means probably 2 pretty early tight ends. It doesn't mean elite tight ends. Like I was talking about taking Bowers. Like, he can be your tight end 2 and you can be done. You can even go a little later than that. But I've done some teams that are like
Bowers is sexy. Bowers is real sexy.
I've done some teams though that are like McBride, Kittle in this, and I'm like, all right, like I'm just go to war with that. Like I had to spend a lot of capital on it, but they were cheap, and like Kittle has a good buy and McBride has a week 11 buy. It's a good buy, and like, all right, I'm going to do a 2 tight end build where I'm hoping these tight ends help me at the flex too, because I went 2 really good tight ends. But it's that, again, it's that type of team that can win the regular season scoring crown, like that one in BBM last year, structurally, and is just right all the way through. That's how you actually win the Eliminator. If you try to just build a floor team, you're going out in like week 5. So, thanks for playing.
That's the we'll do the 0 running back in a second. The floor thing is one of the last important points that we absolutely have to make. That when you build for floor, you inherently often, not always, often build a lack of ceiling. And thus, when you do hit that floor, right? Okay, so congratulations. Those guys provided that floor of 5 points. Your collection of 18 players all did not provide enough raw points. They had a floor, right? So Samaje Perine hit his 4-point floor, but you had 12 guys who all hit their 4-point floor, and you lost because you didn't have any ceiling. You didn't have Devon Achane, who scored 35. You didn't have, Puka Nacua, who scored 35 to offset to pair with the floors. The Zeke's floor, the Gus Edwards floor. You need point. Like you still need raw points.
Yeah.
Like, and especially with the compound interest thing that we were talking about. Like, the further you go. So even you did have Puka Nacua. Guess what? You showed up in 7 people. I'm exaggerating, right? Hyperbole. But you showed up in 7 people in week 7, had Puka Nacua, and you paired him with a bunch of floor guys.
Right.
Puka Nacua having a spike wasn't even enough. Right. Or 2 guys having a spike wasn't enough, because enough other people had those spikes that you need more spikes. You need other guys that your opponents don't have spiking.
You're going to start facing better and better teams in your pods, and you're going to start matching those hits that you had.
Yep.
Your other players have to be hits as well at some point.
They have to have and not just a hit like, oh, cool, I got my 12 Zeke points. Like, no, like at some point, I need somebody to offset, because you're just going to have down weeks, right? Even the regular season winner, wasn't scoring 200 points a week. They were having some lower weeks. They're like, you're just going to have some lower weeks that somebody has to step up somewhere. You need your Sony Michel, you need your Alexander Madison that, like, oh God, like I have 3 guys on bye, and Puka and Achane had a down week, but Dalvin was out. And Tyler and Alexander Madison had that big game, for the Vikings back then. Or Bijan's out, and Tyler Algier this year steps up and survived because I had a ceiling or 2 that just came from somebody else that they didn't have. Right, I layered in to account for the Tyler Algier ceiling that just nobody in that pod had. They had Puka and they had Kyron and they had Achane, but they didn't have Tyler Algier. So I move on to the next. And look, Bijan's back that week, but I survive in advance. And maybe there's less Puka next week because, Puka had his 6-point game as opposed to his 20-point game. That's all, just making up a bullshit example to tell that story. But it's so important. And what I do think it leads to is, not to turn this into a zero running back show, but I think, again, counterintuitively, this format is so goddamn good for that, because zero running back is mostly viewed wrong because we put Sean or whoever, which one of you guys put zero in the name. People think that it's a low scoring, high risk strategy, when in fact it's the stone cold opposite. It's the highest floor thing you can do especially in best ball, where I don't have to pick my points. Like, I don't even have to pick the starting running backs. Like, zero running back can actually be harder in redraft because they show up to week 1 and I'm like, which fucking backup running back am I putting into my lineup?
Right.
Or James Conner or Raheem Mostert. I don't know. In best ball, I just get to draft 6 or 7 of those dudes, and however the point, luck box I used, again, I made the BBM finals last year. Bijan played. I used Tyler Allgeier's score because sometimes the backup running backs just hit. Bijan played like 70% of the snaps and Tyler Allgeier scored 23 fantasy points, because he luck boxed 2 touchdowns. It just goes that way. And so I don't have to pick my starters, but I know the wide receiver firepower, probably my quarterback and tight end firepower, is at worst, I'm not behind at three positions, which is the majority of my roster, right? 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers, and let's count the flex. So 6 of my 8 starting roster spots, I'm not behind at worst. And I'm probably ahead at those. And then through chaos, I can win at the running back position, whether it's the Allgeier chaos, like I just get lucky and he scores some touchdowns, or the guy goes down, or we're just wrong about we're wrong about who the starter is. We're wrong about the value of the backfield. I don't know, Chuba Hubbard or whatever. We're wrong about something at the running back position. Or just like, I didn't need that many points at running back. 2 guys who scored 6 points was enough because the rest of my team is good. There's so many ways that the floor can be built in structurally by being willing to wait on running back and build up the strength of the rest of the roster. And then it also helps you later in the season, right? It's like the perfect thing that we're like, well, I still want to win the $100,000 in week 17. I get those perks, but I also get this high floor throughout the course of the year. And then like the bye week stuff, like, well, how do you navigate the bye weeks? Well, just like having more dudes to throw at the weeks when I have multiple guys on buys. Well, how do you do that? Well, draft 7 fucking running backs, draft 7 wide receivers, have like 14 of those guys, just sheer throw volume at it. It's just like every perk of this structure fits the eliminator format. And I feel like the people are like, I gotta get Saquon, I gotta have Saquon to provide me those early points. And it's like, maybe it is counterintuitive, but I believe in it. Like, even like if not having Saquon in BBM is a little scary. Like, could he show up to week 17 and go for 204? Like, yeah, he could. And I could be buried. Do I care about that in eliminator? Not really. Like, I don't really care about that.
The thing you were just saying about drafting like volume to help and all that too. I mean, one of the points people would be like, okay, well, structurally, what are you guys talking about? I mean, I thought through a couple different structures as I was doing some of my first ones. I was in my first write-up, I mentioned I thought that 2 quarterback builds were viable. That was one of the big things when I did the second piece that I wanted to talk about, where I was like, I actually really do like the stacking stuff when you get the third QB, how that layers in throughout the year and the different weekly ceilings it gives you. So the really cool advantage of the 0RB strategy as well, we talked about the early 2 tight ends freeing up roster spots. So does that. Like you just said, like you don't have to. I mean, if you take 5 receivers in your first 7 rounds, you can stop at 7 pretty easily. You don't have to get to 9 receivers. And so, like, if you're thinking through a structural thing, one thing I will say is I actually think it can always be like one off of this, but I think it's probably going to be optimal or near optimal that it'll be like a 3-6-7-2. That's the one that I think most of my builds land on, where I'm stopping at 7 receivers because I'm getting the early receiver value. Yep. I'm hitting 6 running backs because I'm hitting most of them later, and I'm doing a more extreme 0 RB.
Rounds 9 through the end.
Yeah. Right. I need to get my 3 QBs. I want to get my 3 QBs. I'm getting 2 early tight ends. One thing I will note about that is if you do get to 3, 6, 7, 2, it can be harder to get the 3 stacks and the bringbacks and everything built into your build.
Yep.
And so if you're going to do Bo Nix late, like I said, and you want to do Marvin Mims, Bo Nix late, like you need to leave a receiver spot. Like don't just take all 7 of your early receivers and be like, I'm done at receiver, because then you don't have backstack options. It does confuse things. Although I don't think they all have to be 100% stacked, because it is a little bit of a floor thing. I would say, like, if one of you, if you had to sacrifice something, you could take the Bo Nix pick late without a receiver stacked to him, and it's
Daniel
like,
Jones. Daniel Jones without Neighbors is fine.
A mobile quarterback that gives you some floor to your build and your 3 QB build, but isn't necessarily stacked up. Like, okay, I mean, I'm not gonna hammer you for that necessarily, but I do think the 3, 6, 7, 2 is probably my favorite. You could do 3, 5, 8, 2s in some spots. I think you can do some 2, 6, 8, 2s. I don't think you want to have too many receivers in these builds, because I do think you want to be taking them early for the reasons we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do some 3 tight end builds as well, probably. That would be the other variant you could do. Maybe it's a 3, 5, 7, 3. I don't know. But I think for the most part, I'm seeing a lot of my drafts fall back into 3, 6, 7, 2. And I'm like, I don't want to vary this necessarily. I'm actually like trying to navigate my way to, okay, I'm back to my comfy 3, 6, 7, 2. That's what I think is right. I feel comfortable enough with these 2 tight ends. I stack these quarterbacks up. I want to use the other picks for my 6 running backs. This is what I think is right.
So I will say we're like basically 100% aligned. I'm a lot more 2, 7, 7, 2, but with a lot of these elite quarterbacks, right? And so I'll try to just quickly spitball one off the top, like really waiting on running back. Like you said, 5 wide receivers in the first 7, probably a quarterback and a tight end, just to use an example. But in the first 10 rounds, I'm doubling back for another tight end, like you said. So Kittle Bowers or whatever, Kittle Bowers, something like that. Ingram Ferguson, whatever, Kelsey Ferguson, you get the combinations of those guys in the first 9 or 10. And then, but Lamar's on there, Richardson's on there, whatever quarterback is on there. But also I drafted 5 wide receivers in the first six rounds. So I'm feeling really good there. And then kind of wherever the running back falls is wherever, whether it's the 8th round, 9th round, 10th round, depending upon there. And then I'll leave the wide receivers open for that second quarterback stack, right? It's like, okay, this is going to be Daniel Jones, Wandale come on down, or this is going to be Bo Nix, so Troy Franklin come on down, and so tight end, I'm maybe stacking one of my quarterbacks with one of my tight ends, but tight end that's like a lever that I'm like maybe marginally concerned with from a structural perspective, where I really do like having my tight end correlated with my quarterback, if at all possible, like just like hitting those 2 spots.
Because the whole season long element of it, like tight ends do better on higher scoring teams. And if you're right on your QB, then the tight end's going to have more chance to score touchdowns, which is just more impactful at tight end. I get it.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So that's like maybe like the one small thing I'm a little bit concerned about, but you can still do Lamar Andrews. You can still do Mahomes, Kelsey. There's lots, Lawrence, Ingram. There's a ton of things that you can still do with that. But that's kind of like because I have that elite quarterback, is like, I'm even more comfortable just like really pushing running back through because of the reasons we've talked about here. But because like, dude, I got Lamar's on this team, Andrews is on this team, 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. And maybe I even came back for Bowers. And it's like, dude, this team is absolutely loaded, and I've already set up what my win condition is to our stuff. Like Lamar Andrews is the thing, Bowers is like backfilling that, maybe even flexing a little bit, and I got the wide receiver juice. I do still have some flexibility with wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7, and now it's like we're spamming the 0 running back. We're like mixing and matching. That gives me the flexibility with the running back buy stuff, right? I want to be like, oh shit, I already drafted 2 week 14. My first 2 running backs are week 14. Next guy, is maybe week 12 or whatever, and then I just start to like put all those puzzle pieces together, and I have just enough flexibility with the later wide receivers and the quarterback too, but also like so much firepower at quarterback, wide receiver, tight end that like I'm pretty confident with 2. But to your point, I do feel some nerves a little bit about like, I think the 3 quarterbacks, like I don't actually love the 3 quarterback thing in like BBM and stuff, which some people are going to disagree with me that we don't need to get into that.
I'm today. More similar to you on that. I do like just sticking to 2.
I love just like the ability to throw. I talked about throwing volume at it. earlier at the running back wide receiver flex, just like having more quantity to win the flex in BBM, like that gauntlet. I know this gauntlet in Eliminator, we're talking about how difficult it is, but like to finish first week 15, 16, 17, like first, not in the top half, first in week 15, 16, and 17, 3 weeks in a row. I really want to have so many different options to just be like, oh, running backs out here. Oh, running backs out. And like, because
QB is like a high floor position. It's harder to necessarily differentiate.
Yeah. But just give me the guy who scores, or give me the pair of guys who between the two of them, they score 25 each week for 3 weeks. Like who gives a fuck? Like I'm good with those guys, but I want to have all these 14 options to fill my 6 roster spots. That's really, really hard in BBM. Whereas in Eliminator, I do feel like what you're saying with the quarterback thing, I'm more open to it, again, to like the David Montgomerys. Like I'm more open to the 3 quarterback thing in the Eliminator aspect because it is very different.
Yeah. And so I would say the only thing about the 2772, to the extent that you're kind of asking my opinion on it, is it's very slightly different from what I was saying 3672. It's just that last spot. Did you use like your 18th round pick on Bo Nix, or did you use it on a 7th running back? It's ultimately what it is. And I think I would say I don't think 2772 is wrong by any means. Like I absolutely have done 2 QB builds in the Eliminator, and I think they're very defensible. But I think you do get yourself in trouble where, like, I mean, obviously when either of those quarterbacks on a bye, the other one has to score. Because I think you could still advance with a low QB score. Like, someone was telling me, well, if your QB's injured, the other one's on a bye, you're done. Like, I don't think you're dead. I mean, if you get enough
technically
wide receiver and running back, you can still finish middle of the pack in your pod. It's not impossible. But it is.
You're talking about 15 points. You need to make up 15 points somehow.
But it can be, somewhat problematic there because you don't want to have QB floors. The thing that I remember from like really early on in best ball, like the MFL 10 days and all that stuff, was adding a third QB when like roster constructions were different, was that adding a third QB did elevate your floor. It was like 25 or 50 points across the season or something like that. Like, because the way that QB scoring, they all have a high floor, but there are like spike weeks at QB.
Right.
And it is going to meaningfully give you
can layer QB points. Because you can layer
QB points. Exactly. Because there will be some weeks in a 2 QB build where they both scored 12 and below. And you're like, this is a tough week for me quarterback wise. And so I do think the third QB is a high floor across a weekly. So the way that you're describing it for BBM in weeks 15, 16, 17, you want to have these bullets at the other positions. I think that makes perfect sense because running back and receiver, to me, I would say the extra bullets are high ceiling bullets. Those are, you're looking for spike weeks, that late round wide receiver who goes for 150 and a TD at in week 16, which can totally happen with a late round receiver. I don't know a great example off the top of my head, but that's why we're drafting Marvin Mims. That's why we're drafting Troy Franklin. I was just talking about those guys, that they can give us a 150 in one game in week 16. And the scoring floor is lower at running back and receiver. So that spike week can be so impactful when it hits your flex, like you were talking about. But over the course of a full season, the 3 QB thing does feel to me more like a floor element. And then the kicker for me was then if I also stack all 3 of them up, I can build in the stack elements.
I think that's maybe the part that like makes it significantly more viable. Is just like just taking 3 quarterbacks, and it's not correlated to the team success that you put, right? Those 18 people, like we talked about earlier, like I care about the floor and in the upside of my collection of 18 players, not necessarily any one of them individually. I think that quarterback is the biggest part of that. Why could Bo Nix raise the floor of this team that has Trevor Lawrence and Kirk Cousins? Is because, like you said, of course, the layering effect is a thing, but because when he does have those good weeks, it's correlated to other spots on my team as well. Yeah. So I'm hitting 2 or 3 even, especially like you'd stack up a few different they're so goddamn cheap. Like the Broncos that's in an individual week, right? Bo Nix has his 25-point game. Troy Franklin catches 2 touchdowns. Like, boom, dude, I spent 2 auction dollars, literally 2 auction dollars on 2 monster weeks. But also in the Texans example of last year, or the Bucks example, or the first year of Geno example with Seahawks, like on and on down the list of how wrong we are about all these NFL offenses. When we're just wrong and like, oh no, the Texans are just like really good on offense, you also can raise that floor like X. If you drafted CJ Stroud, Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Devin Singletary on teams all together, like you want to talk about a fucking floor raiser. Like Jesus Christ, man, you were just getting incredible, like just as much as Kyron Puka thing, and all you did was make 1 Texans bet. You're like, what if the Texans aren't bad on this team and you drafted all
Stroud's
of them?
Good?
Yeah. What if Stroud's good? And like, oh, by the way, Dameon Pierce.
What if the S2 cognitive test is bullshit?
Like Tank Dell had, 12,000 yards in college. That seems pretty good. Like, let's toss him on here. And Dameon Pierce, are we sure he's better than Devin Singletary? Like, the next thing you toss that together and like, geez, man, the floor plus ceiling is so powerful. So before we get out, I want to hear we can't leave the show with our eliminator player takes being David Montgomery and James Conner and that kind of thing. So any specific players that you've been, really honing in on more so in eliminator, and then just like any kind of strategic thoughts that we, it could be a little more galaxy brain or just anything around this contest that we haven't got to.
It's not really galaxy brain, but when we were just talking through this third QB thing, it did bring me back to what was really the thrust of my first eliminator article that I wrote, which was this idea that you can't build contingencies into your lineup for everything. And I think people approach the eliminator thinking I'm going to have floor everywhere. I'm going to have a 3 QB build, a 3 tight end build. I'm going to have contingencies everywhere. Everything's going to be covered. That's what I need to do. I need to be safer, higher floor. You still have to make bets. So what you're doing with your 2 QB one, for anyone who thinks that's crazy, is you're saying, yeah, I understand there's risk here, but I have to take on risk somewhere. It's not less risky to take on 3 QBs. It's just moving the risk over to running back or to wide receiver when those guys are on bye. And I don't have very many active running backs. If you only have if you go 3 QBs, 3 tight ends, you go 3, 5, 7, 3, there's going to be weeks where one of those 5 running backs is on a bye. Now you're down to 4 running backs. How confident are you that those 4 running backs are going to be good enough and whatever and get you the points that you need? Sometimes it's going to be 3 because one of them's going to be missing. That's kind of my point. Like, how confident are you that they're all going to be healthy at the same time? So this idea of you can't build in contingencies for everything is, I think, a really important one. You still have to draft like you're right. You still have to make the bets that you think are really important bets. When you ask me about player takes, I mean, I think, and especially also the CJ Stroud thing where it's like, oh, that feels risky. But like that was a high upside bet on a rookie quarterback and then the whole offense coming with him. And if you hit on that directionally, man, how big of a hit can that possibly be? And it can be massive, obviously. And so I do think like one of the bets, we were talking about the buy stuff. One of the bets you can make is you can stack some of your buys more intentionally. Like the Bo Nix thing. One of the things with the 3 QB things is it does free you up to potentially do 2 of your QBs have the same buy, which is risky. But you can take on that risk if you want to. You're going to
take on that risk with only 2 quarterbacks anyway, right? Like you're naturally going to have one on a bye. 2 different weeks. Right. You're going to have guys. Exactly. At least this way, you would only have one week where that was the case.
Yep. And so a lot of people like Drake May as well. Late also has the week 14 bye. I tend to lean more towards Knicks myself, but those guys obviously.
I'm not drafting Drake May in the eliminator. I'm not drafting Drake May.
I wouldn't draft. I don't draft Drake May in a lot of stuff, frankly. I'm concerned about the playing time there, but I've been trying to draft a little bit more of him. I eventually will get more of him. I think he's going to be like. I think it's going to be last round more clear that he's not going to start week 1, and then he's in August. He's going to be like not an interesting play. Yep. Bo Nix, I do think is going to get more expensive. So, because I think he's going to be clearly the starter. He's such a perfect fit for Sean Payton's scheme. So, him and the Detroit, the Denver stuff is, you're talking about player takes, is definitely one that I would say. I just pulled up my eliminator buy-ins and Javonte Williams or exposures. Javonte Williams is my highest exposure player in the eliminator. I'm drafting him in every format though, so it's a great example of where like I'm making the bets in the eliminator that I think are the best bets overall. Bucky Irving's right behind that. He's one of my favorite picks. Kentre Miller's one of my favorite picks. He's in a lot of these eliminator builds. JSN, who is a little bit of a lower floor play with JSN's just bad. That's kind of the concern with his price right now. I feel like I think the routes are going to be there. It's kind of like the Quentin Johnson thing. I think his role is going to be there, and I think there's a lot of ceiling to him. And so I've been really buying him. I mentioned him and Deontay Johnson in that range of like round 6-ish now, wide receivers. They were previously round 7. In the second round, I'm taking the guys that can project for a lot of volume. I mentioned Brandon Ayuk earlier, but I'm not taking a lot of him. It's just like because the buy is nice. But like I love getting Drake London and Chris Olave, where I'm like I can tell myself 150 targets on these guys. Like that's I actually have a lot more conviction in my second round picks in the eliminator. I want the dudes that I feel like the target volume is going to be consistent every single week all year. I feel comfortable about it. I'm not taking Marvin Harrison in the eliminator. That's where like the Marvin Harrison play to me is very. I don't think it's full season volume. Like even Puka Nacua had a massive volume last year, but Chase and Jefferson, when they hit as rookies, and they're great examples, they're upside cases for what Harrison could be. There's risk below that. They both were in the 120s in targets. They weren't 150 target guys. Their year 2, they both went up in targets meaningfully. Both of them added at least 2 targets per game in their second season, even though they were rookie hits, because you don't just walk into an NFL locker room and command 10 targets a game unless you're Puka Nacua. But like that was a Matthew Stafford. Like, he's kind of a unique case in my opinion. And also the difference between Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase and Harrison is the first 3 all had more pocket passers. You had Stafford, you had Cousins, and you had Joe Burrow. Harrison's going to a team with a mobile quarterback as well, which impacts the passing volume a little bit too. When I did the projection for them, I pushed Harrison. I got him into the 130s in targets. Still looked like he was a little bit overvalued. I understand the back-weighted element when you're talking about BBM. For Eliminator, I want more stable volume. It's this idea of stability plus upside. Like, when people talk about Harrison, they talk about, well, he has this potential for a spike week in the fantasy playoffs. And I always bring up Devontae Adams, had 170 targets last year, wasn't particularly productive, but had a spike week in the playoffs. It's not like that type of guy can't spike week as well. In fact, I would bet on the dude that's getting 10 targets a game to spike week more likely than trying to pick out George Pickens' random one-off spike week like he had, which was not really in line with the rest of his season. So anyway, those are the types of like things I'm thinking through at different layers, and some of the exposures, some of the running backs. To me, it's like it's the full season bets you love. There's some buy elements. Like, I've taken a lot of Jared Goff. He feels like a nice play. He's cheap. He's stable. He's a week 5 buy. He's my highest drafted quarterback in this, probably taking an abnormal amount of earlier Detroit players as well because of the week 5 buy, which makes him a nice stack ad. So anyway, that's a bunch of my player takes.
I love that. Also, now I'm embarrassed because I'm going to pull up my exposures just quickly, and some of those guys are players that I have quite a bit of. Marv over here at 13%, but
I could be wrong on Marv. I'm just saying, like, it feels like a lower.
No. I like this take. I think that it's super interesting, and I've just been blindly.
You're good at London, Olave, and Nico in the next group. Like that.
So Adams, as you can see here, as you can see on your screen, Christian McCaffrey 0, Bijan Robinson 0, Breece Hall 0, Jahmyr Gibbs 0.
Tyreek 101 in this, or Lamb 101 in this.
So, like, why is this happening? And I'm naturally going to be overweight on basically all of these wide receivers, and I'm doing exactly what you said. You see Brandon Ayuk 4%. I actually didn't plan for Debo to be at only 4%, right? But like the exposure's got to go somewhere when I'm drafting basically exclusively wide receivers. But I was just going to point out, like, you see the blue is some of the heaviest exposure here, the darker colors, and it's a lot of the tight ends and the elite quarterbacks, as you can see. So Trey McBride, Brock Bowers down here at 17%, Kyle Pitts at 17%, George Kittle at 10%. Basically every elite, I'm overweight, every single elite tight end. We got to get the Mark Andrews up here, buddy. But a lot of elite quarterback, a lot of elite tight ends. And then we move on down to the old 0 running back range, and you see a pretty, flat spread of all the 0 running back guys. 10% Zach Moss, 8% Jalen Warren, Chase Brown, Kendra Miller, Zach Charbonnet, Trey Benson, and on down the list. Definitely, after our conversation today, like, got to get some of these up, right? Got to get some of these up. I think that they're great picks. I think that you specifically outlined a lot of awesome reasons. This is so 52. This, I think there might be a little.
Najee is another one that's gross, but I'm more willing to take him in the Eliminator because he has a good buy.
Yep.
If Warren got hurt, I mean, Arthur Smith's going to give him the running backs a ton of work. Like, there's still some contingency upside if Warren were to get hurt as well. Like, both of the Steelers backs are really nice ones in that range.
The perfect example of what did you call it? Like projection plus contingency or whatever it was.
Stability plus upside.
Stability plus upside is so spot on that, like, I didn't want it to sound like, draft all the olds earlier when we draft the old running backs, because that wasn't the case. But those names happen to have the stability plus the ceiling that is exactly what we want.
Because in 2024, we're pricing down all of those guys universally. And so it's like, well, what their structure is priced down to their stability, relative to their stability. And some of them do still actually have some upside. I don't still want to make those bets in like BBM because it's a tricky bet. But this is the format where, you know, if you were looking for a reason to get James Conner exposure, go do some eliminators, buddy.
That is me. I'm Buddy in this example. I don't see James Conner's name in BBM, but I get to eliminator and I'm like, oh, that's, and you see that I need to do it even more. But we got to get out of here. Ben has written, as we've mentioned multiple times, about 40,000 words on eliminator strategy. I'll put those in the description. Make sure you, of course, go subscribe to the Stealing Signals YouTube channel, where honestly, what Ben is doing around his slow draft stuff, I thought was so cool and such a unique way to kind of, you know, there's I'm not trying to throw shade. There's about 4.6 million Best Ball live draft streams out there nowadays on YouTube and in the content space, and everybody's doing it. It's awesome. The industry is great, but seeing you do the slow draft stuff and like talk through, all right, I'm on the clock in 30 slows. Let's walk through how I'm making all my picks. I was like, this is awesome content. So everybody should check that out. And I'm stealing it a little bit myself because I've gotten into the slow draft streets and taken some inspiration from Ben. But anything else that you got on the horizon for the folks?
I've been doing a new YouTube channel over at Stealing Signals. Just started it up. I've been doing some videos there Wednesdays and stuff. Probably see if you want to come join me sometime, because I can't do the live draft. Sometimes having some guests on, drafted on their account. It's great. It's the only way I can do a live draft. I need a buddy. But yeah, go subscribe there and turn on notifications, all that stuff. The Substack, bengretch.substack.com. Stealing Bananas, Ship Chasing, my normal pods. Yeah, that's about it. Oh, awesome. The Leone Projections podcast, the Projections podcast series with Mike Leone right now is a really cool one. People really enjoy over on Establish the Edge's podcast feed as well. We just started that up.
Yeah, definitely make sure to go check those out. We also just recently had Leone on Legendary Sickos, where we did a fun episode of Aren't You Worried? And Leone was quite worried about absolutely everything. It was great. So check those out. Go check out Stealing Signals, and we'll see you guys next time. That's the show. Peace.